owes itself to the slaves is wildly ahistorical. And I'd add one other thing. It's the same thing with my own country of birth, Great Britain. Great Britain benefited from the slave trade, benefited from the era of colonialism. But it's actually been estimated that Britain spent more, lost more, in abolishing the slave trade by policing the high seas for decades after we abolished it ourselves in Britain and stopped the Brazilians and others trading slaves across the Atlantic, that Britain actually cost us more to abolish slavery, pay off the slave owners and much more. It cost us more than we gained through the trade. In fact, Britain only stopped paying off its debt, literally its debt, about 5 or 6 years ago. So this was an incredibly costly thing to abolish slavery for both Britain and America. And the people who pretend that we only benefited from it never take this into account.
Well, I would also add that it's not the differentiating factor in our preeminence in technology innovation and existing at the height of civilization.
We got rid of this 200 years ago.
And the Arab slave trade continued, and Brazil had slaves, and we talked about it throughout the world. Slavery and there are 40 colonialism was par for the course. Therefore, it's not the differentiating factor that made America uniquely exceptional.
No, and there are 40 million slaves estimated to be in the world today. 40 million, which is more than there were in the 19th century. Is that an interesting factor to anyone? It's an interesting factor to me. But again, your anti-racist, anti-slavery activists in America don't seem to give a damn about that.
Well, I can hear New York City in the background of your apartment.
That was a driver agreeing with that point.
I know that you are by the way, congratulations. You are a new, I don't know if you've achieved citizenship, but you are a new resident of the United States of America. And I love your love for America, even with your criticism of America being an exporter of this world poison of woke ideology. Okay, for many, it feels like all this stuff cropped up overnight. It feels like the last 2 years, and it's become acute, Douglas, over the last 2 years. But, when we were talking about what makes America different in its self-hatred from the other Western civilizations or Enlightenment civilizations, I was kind of listening to hear if you would bring up academia, because I know it's a big part of your analysis. And this is where it dovetails with our mutual friend Pete Hegseth's research. He has a new book out, The Miseducation of America. And the truth is, I believe, and I think you share this view, this isn't something that has happened overnight. This isn't something that simply flows in the wake of George Floyd. This isn't a 2-year national navel-gazing experiment. This has been baking in the cake for decades.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, it started off in the 60s and 70s. I traced the origins of this. I'm always slightly wary about talking about academia too much, because I think academics, like writers and intellectuals, can overemphasize their own importance. For most of us, we imbibe this as though in the water these days. Most Americans do not need to know, certainly shouldn't know, what a couple of mad lunatics at Berkeley are doing. But this stuff does have a trickle-down effect. There's no doubt about that. So what happens in academia has spilled out in recent decades. As Andrew Sullivan famously said, we all live on campus now. And so there is a considerable truth in that. But here's some more important thing in a way. The popular culture has imbibed deeply cultural revolutionary ideas. And they were lying in wait for the right moment. And I would say that the aftermath of the death of George Floyd was the right moment for them to be pushed through everything, through sport, through academia, through all government departments, through the Democrat primaries, with all of the contenders saying that they were going to look into reparations, for instance, through CNN saying before Independence Day weekend in 2020 that the president is going to speak at Mount Rushmore this evening, kicking off Independence Day weekend by standing in front of images of 2 slavers standing on stolen land. So that kind of extreme rhetoric came up very recently. Even 5 years ago, CNN wouldn't have said that Mount Rushmore just showed a couple of slavers and that it was stolen land. So this stuff came very fast. And here, however, is the important and interesting and rather positive thing. the critical race theory, which is an element of what we're talking about here, which as you say, Pete and others have written about and spoken about, the critical race theory started in American academia and has tried to be pushed on the American public. Here's the good news. Its first meeting with the public has not gone well. They were working away on this theory in academia where, for instance, white people had to be said to be born into complete sin and everyone else is born into innocence. The only bad people are the white people, everybody else is good. They've been working on this. And when they introduced it to schools and things, they met their great opponent, which was American parents. The American parents said no. This theory doesn't work. Why does the theory not work? Because it involves telling my child or my child's friend that because of the color of their skin, they're evil. Now, the wizards at Berkeley and elsewhere hadn't really thought about that. It meant saying that children are bad because of the color of their skin. So I'm actually quite positive about some of this because I think that whenever a theory so swiftly meets the public and the public push it back so strongly, then there's hope. And there is considerable hope in America on this. And the hope is the American public.
And that response by the American public is in no small measure through the work of a guy named Chris Rufo, who works at the Manhattan Institute and City Journal. And that takes me back to this thought experiment you brought up a moment ago, where you brought up, where do we turn when we're looking for a vaccine to a worldwide pandemic? We don't turn to Aboriginal cultures, we turn to the West. So I want to ask you about, I heard you say this, I believe, in an interview with Gerard Butler at the Wall Street Journal, and I found it fascinating. You talked about this moment where Chris Rufo had an encounter with Marc Lamont Hill. You said in the interview that you know Marc Lamont Hill, as do I. And throughout the last several years, I would have described Marc as a friend at times, despite his very radical ideas. And I would tell Marc that to his face. And I think you have similar compliments in that Marc is a smart guy. Marc and I are diametrically, philosophically opposed to one another. However, there was this moment where Marc said to Chris Rufo, here's what I like about being black. And he named all these things about black culture. And then he pushed Chris Rufo, what is it you like about being white? And you said something interesting, Douglas. You said Rufo chose an option, which career-wise was probably the right option, wherein he said, I don't think of myself that way. I don't go about defining myself that way, which, by the way, I would say is accurate. If somebody asked me that question, my answer would probably be similar.
It's like if somebody said to me, like, what do you like about being a guy? I'd be like,
right.
I don't know. I don't really think about that. I mean,
right.
Like, it's you know, sometimes it's great, sometimes it's better. I don't think you go, you know, what's it like? Who does that?
I wouldn't know the answer to that. What do you like about being white? Because I don't walk around thinking about how great it is to be white. And I'm sure somewhere out there, there's somebody says, well, see there, that's privilege. But what I really was fascinated by was your second answer, which you said Rufo could have chosen the nuclear option. And the nuclear option meaning nuke his own career, most likely, which is he could have bragged about the accomplishments of, and I think these are in your words, in essence, white culture. But white culture, I think, as defined by the extrapolations of the Anglosphere West, to take this back full circle to where we started, wherein he could have talked about space travel or modern medicine, or, as you mentioned, the scientific method. Tell me more about that, because I'll be real with you, Douglas. You're not wrong, but even reading it and probably even having this conversation right now, it's somewhat uncomfortable because it feels so ripe for someone to say racist.
Right, sure. No, I knew that as I was writing it. And of course, there's already been backlash about this passage. I just urge people, obviously, to buy the book and to read this for themselves, because I think, if I say so myself, it's a very important question, this. The question to Chris Rufo, as you say, there was one option available to him, which is the one he took, which is, I don't like to be thinking about myself in these terms, which, by the way, would be my answer.
As mine.
Pushed, there's a second answer, which is to say, look, basically, white is like the convening point, do we? Let's just say it's like the United Nations. Like, everyone can be a member. You don't care. You know, it's not like, okay, if you want to say that white people can't become black or whatever, fine. But look, anyone who wants to be part of what's called the white Western tradition, fine. You know, we want it to be polyglot.